Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kelly Nurick, Senior Director of Products and Services with the Small Business Association of Michigan. Now more than ever, small businesses need to be protected from cyber attacks. Yet many of our members find cyber solutions to be expensive, complicated, and time-consuming. That's where our approved partner, SensCy, comes into play. SensCy simplifies cybersecurity for you and provides deliverables that identify your cybersecurity vulnerabilities and reduce your risk and ensure that you can recover should an attack occur. Our webinar today will talk about how recovering from a cyber attack requires that your organization's cyber hygiene be in place before an incident occurs. We will discuss the importance of an incident response plan and why every organization must have one. Presenting today are Raj Patel, SensCy's Chief Growth Officer, and our special guest from McDonald Hopkins law firm, Colin Battersby. For the last 20 years, Raj is a partner and practice leader of Plant Moran Cybersecurity Consulting Practice. He joined the firm in 2002 to build the practice from the ground up. Under his leadership, the team grew to nearly 100 professionals, serving large and small clients in both the private and public sector. Through his vast knowledge and highly sought-after cybersecurity expertise, Raj cultivated a strong reputation for trust and value in Southeast Michigan. Crain's Detroit Business recognized Raj as a 40 Under 40 recipient in 2009 and an American Dreamers Award winner in 2007 for his professional accomplishments. He's often quoted in national and regional publications and recently was featured in a cover story for CIO magazine discussing the importance of cybersecurity in the remote work environment. Raj's articles have been published in various publications, including Corporate Board Member, Chief Executive, CFO, and on MarketWatch. He also wrote cyber blogs for Crain's Detroit Business. Colin Battersby is our special guest from McDonald Hopkins Law Firm in Bloomfield Hills. He's a member in the firm's National Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice Group. He's certified by the International Association of Privacy Professionals as a certified information professional for the United States, which is considered the gold standard for information privacy professionals. He advises clients on best practices to prevent and respond to cybersecurity concerns, including lead a data breach incident response efforts in combination with forensic technical vendors and company decision makers. He provides counsel on post-breach notice obligations in accordance with state data breach notice statutes or special contractual obligations, drafts, and coordinates the delivery of required notice through the United States and advises on post-breach remedial measures. Prior to joining McDonald Hopkins, Colin was the co-founder and co-leader of the cybersecurity and data privacy service at Miller, Canfield, Paddock & Stone. He earned his JD from Wayne State University Law School in 2007 and received a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Michigan in 2004. So just to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. We'll send you a link with an email for you to refer to later. You are currently muted, but we encourage you to submit any questions through the chat feature and we'll answer them as we go along. So with no further ado, I will pass it on to Raj with SensCy to kick us off.
Thank you, Kelly.
Sound good.
Good.
Yep.
Well, welcome everyone. I missed the splendid opening of from Kelly, so hopefully she said all good things about me and Colin. And so let's talk about you getting hacked or your organization getting hacked. And I would say today any organization can experience a cyber attack. And the difference really is how ready are you, whether it's your preventive controls, your detective controls, or your controls how to recover from an incident. So I would say it's very similar to what happened during COVID. You can be very healthy and you can still catch COVID. I would say cyber is similar. This could happen to anyone, but what we're going to try to do, Colin and I, is help you prepare so you can recover effectively from an attack with minimal disruption. So just last month, there was a major breach at Michigan Medicine, and what I want to point out here is Michigan Medicine actually has a great cyber team. I know some of them. They've put in the right controls in place, and even they got hacked. But the difference is they had a team that noticed the issues right away, quickly acted upon it, and were able to stop that breach. And my concern is for smaller organizations, you might not have the resources or the team in place to figure out when a hack happens and how quickly to react to it. So it can happen in Michigan. Actually, just in the last couple of days, there's a major ransomware attack in the Bay Area, and there's a number of companies that have been impacted by that ransomware attack. So it can happen to any organization anytime during the year. Just a little bit on the FBI crime report. So from 2020 to 2021, there was a 64% increase in the loss from a cyber attack. So the loss was 6.9 billion, but that was a 64% increase. And then the one that the fact that really concerned me was there was 2.4 billion in financial losses from phishing attacks, and the FBI was only able to put a hold on 329 million. So the remaining 87%, they lost that money. That money was gone, and businesses could not recover that money. So that's the problem with cyber attacks today, is they're financial in nature, and sometimes they're also ransomware in nature. So it impacts an organization from operations and financial background. So the consequences of a data breach are quite significant. First, obviously, you could lose your customer trust. So your customers expect you to protect their data, and if you lose the data, you lose their trust. Or even if you're shut down for 3 days, you could lose their trust or lose a customer. They might go find an alternate company. There's also disclosure of trade secrets. That's something that happens quite a bit, where whether it's other countries or your competitors are stealing your data or your trade secrets. It could also be your employees sharing those details with outsiders. The other one is obviously the business reputation gets ruined. You'd be in the papers. Everyone would know about it. And then lastly, Colin, I'm going to have you talk about the regulator fines as well as the jail time that we're seeing.
Yeah, so one of the many unfortunate realities of a cyber attack, where your business is actually the victim of a crime here, is you do have some obligations when you've been victimized, and assuming there's been a compromise of protected data that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, an obligation to report that to certain regulators, usually state's attorney general, depending on where the impacted individuals reside, and those AGs, can open investigations to determine, what were you doing in advance of this attack in order to make sure that that data that you have was protected. We have some affirmative obligations, standards of care that we have to observe to make sure that we are taking appropriate measures for the sensitive data that we have that is defined by state statute to be protected. So in instances where businesses are not doing that, where certain things are not encrypted, or we're not using multi-factor authentication, or we're just doing things that are below the standard of care at this point, there is an opportunity for state AGs to assess fines. To the extent you're a HIPAA covered entity, I don't know who's on the line that might be, but the Office of Civil Rights for Health and Human Services will assess fines for violations of statutory obligations to protect data. And there will be also some scrutiny on the response effort. Did you, comply with the obligations you had to notify in a timely fashion an appropriate substance, which can be examined and can be ultimately the basis for fines and penalties. Good news is, of course, some of the stuff we're talking about here today, will reduce the likelihood of that being an issue if you are prepared for this. As Raj said, I like the COVID analogy. You can be perfectly healthy and still have this issue. If you can demonstrate to regulators that you had a good policy in place, you had a good team in place, appropriate technology, you trained your employees, et cetera, and you responded appropriately. I have yet to see somebody get fined or have penalized as a result of that. It's usually repeat behavior or inappropriate attention to detail. So good news here, if you're listening to us, that's a good start, and ultimately putting some things in place will be helpful. The headline here about the CISO going to jail, I think, is certainly an attention grabber. If you get down into the story about what went on there, it starts to be quite significant in the sense that the behavior demonstrated was really out of line. The CISO, and there's some good questions about whether the CISO acted alone, and in fact, it sounds like there was some collaboration with other higher ups in the organization at Uber to basically cover up a data breach. Through the course of investigating one matter, they discovered another, and rather than report on that, they took some steps to obfuscate and ultimately try to get around that. And the going to jail this is obviously kind of a shockwave. Haven't seen that yet before. I don't see facts like this very often, so I don't think it's going to be the kind of thing that we see being an issue as long as people are reporting appropriately. But it is a cautionary tale that we do have obligations to report, and following up on those and making sure we're doing so appropriately is expected. So I think that's the take. The more translatable takeaway, besides don't cover up and don't commit fraud, is follow the obligations that you have, which are triggered when you have a security incident.
Thanks, Colin. And the CISO is the Chief Information Security Officer. It's his responsibility to make sure not only that the company is protected, but if there's a breach, like Colin said, that the procedures are followed and the notifications happen. So I think the key takeaway from this story is that, again, if you have a breach, make sure you follow the steps we're going to show you in a few minutes, because they'll help you stay away from trouble. So what I want to point about is hacker spray on the weak. Just like in the wild, the hunter spray on the weak, and that's what happens today. Hackers will cast a wide net, and the weak will get sucked in, and there'll be a breach, and the ones that are strong and prevented will be fine. And a simple example is any phishing scam involves a number of different email addresses, and the ones that get caught are the ones employees that click on something. And if you look at the Michigan Medicine breach, it was really 4 to 5 employees clicked on the link, and that compromised the whole organization. So the key is, be strong when it comes to cyber attacks, and you can stop 80% of the breaches. Let's do a quick poll, get some participation from the audience. So will your organization face a data breach in the next 12 months? Is it most definitely, probably a remote chance? Nah. If you could just click on the one, and this isn't, we wouldn't figure out the answers, we just want to see if the audience feels. Okay, then what feedback we get. So I'm surprised 54% feel there's a remote chance. I would have more put myself probably or most definitely, but again, there's another equal number that feel like like the results from last night. It's a weird divided nation here also. So just for the ones that feel most definitely, probably one of the things we let me just get the right slide, is at SensCy, we have a SensCy score. And the purpose of the score is to evaluate what controls you have. And if you had a score of 800 above, you stand a good chance of not of surviving a cyber attack, or maybe even preventing a cyber attack. And so if you wanted to get a free evaluation, it's about a 20-minute meeting where we go through what different controls you have, and it generates a score like a FICO score. And that might help you see if your organization is ready and has got all the right controls in place and able to fight cybercrime. So If you would like that pre-score, just send me an email at rajpatel@sensci.com. That's patel@sensci.com, and we'll schedule a 20-minute virtual call with you and walk you through the evaluation and give you a score at the end of the meeting. So I hope you take up on that offer. Just another statistic before we go into kind of the meat of the presentation is when we look at small businesses, the stats we're seeing is 50% of small businesses have experienced an attack. More than 70% of the attacks are targeted small businesses. In that some of the businesses don't survive the breach because it could be ransomware, it could be data loss. So I think it's something that you might want to think about, the stats that in the poll and how you answered your poll, and see if that would change your mind, and you might want to be a little bit better prepared against cyber threats. So let's go into the meat of the presentation. So let's look at a scenario where you have been hacked. You're trying to figure out what happened. The hacker has taken your information, has promised to keep it safe until you pay a requested ransom. So what are the things you need to do in this scenario? Hopefully you've got a process in place and you already know what to do. But this would be the steps that you would follow. So first, Colin, do you want to talk about incident versus breach?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we deal with when we're confronting a potential security issue is this is a messaging thing. So I'm an attorney, but I kind of wear a quasi PR hat too when we talk about how we're going to refer to these events as they're happening. Breach is a defined term. Breach is a legally defined term that in state statutes is typically the name in combination with some protected element, and I'll talk about those elements in a moment. But not every system compromise is a data breach per se. You can have a system compromise where they don't take any data at all, they don't look at any data, they don't acquire any data. I'd say those are becoming much more uncommon anymore. There used to be more of those where it's just a drive-by encryption event and they locked you up, and if you could get out of that with the backups or paying for a key, you were good. But there are events where they don't actually take data. There are events when they take data, but it's not protected data. They can take company financials, they can take contractual relationship or data. They can take customer lists, employee lists. If it doesn't include certain elements, that's not a data breach. It's certainly a headache for the business, but it's not a situation where you have a notifiable event. So on the next slide, we have some. Go ahead, Raj.
I would say the thing you got to think about here is if you have cyber insurance, they will look at when you first call something a breach, because you might have 90 days or a certain period of days to report the breach. So you want to train yourself and your team not to call it a breach, call it more of an incident till you really know it's a breach, because your clock might start ticking even from a cyber insurance standpoint.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It's also from a regulatory standpoint, which is why we stick away from breach until he's hit that definition, because the timing for notice to individuals can be, in Vermont you have to notify within 14 days of a breach to the AG, and other states it's 30 days. So we really wait until we've actually established that there's been the compromise of that data to start using the word breach, because we don't want to trigger that early. And then when we talk about what is the type of personal information, the protected information that we're concerned about, in every state, and I keep referring to the different states, right? It's a unique thing in privacy law that the law that controls is the state where the individual who is impacted resides. It's not where you do business. It's not where your brick and mortar is. It's where your employee or a former employee now resides, or to the extent you're customer facing and collect personal information from customers, is where they reside. So when we talk about data breaches, we're looking at the entire landscape sometimes, even when you have a primary presence in Michigan. So you're going to have socials, driver's license numbers, and financial account information, including debit or credit cards, are going to be PII, protected information, that when exposed with a person's name is going to be notifiable breach in every state that has a statute, which is all states. Where you can get into a little bit of the difficulty here, or the complexity, I should say, really, is that the other types of information on the slide is going to be PII in certain states. So medical information, I think there's about 20 medical health insurance we can kind of lump together, about 20 states where that's protected. The rest of the states is not. So I'll talk a little bit about the process we go through here from a legal analysis later. But when we get back a list of who's impacted and what data is it that's impacted for them, if we see people with health insurance information and they reside in Michigan, they're not getting a notification letter because that information is not protected in Michigan. It hasn't been a data breach, but it may be if they reside in Texas, they are, for example. So same kind of thing with biometric information, state IDs, passports, military IDs, tax IDs. Digital signature is going to be in, I think, 2 or 3 different states is protected. Dates of birth, Washington and Dakota, and which is a regular source of angst amongst our clients and us, because it seems silly that dates of birth are protected, but they are. But we'll also see username and email passwords that are protected in certain states, and then license plates or vehicle information numbers. So it really will depend ultimately on what it is that's exposed in the incident, where the people reside. And it's important to focus on this and think about when you're building your plan, where do I keep this information? So when we're talking about how are we protecting it, it's going to be really important to know that where we have it, and also keeping track of that it's in limited locations and it's secure in those locations. And if we don't need it, we're not collecting it, so that we can ultimately avoid exposure in the event that we have a security issue.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. I went to a client, and when I was at the front desk, they asked for my driver's license. They scanned the driver's license, and then I went inside and I was meeting with the CEO of the company, and I'm like, why did you collect my driver's license purposes? And I said, so what are you going to do with it? And as we started discussing, they really didn't need my copy of my driver's license. They could have looked at it and verified my identity. But the fact that they kept the driver's license, now they have to protect all the information. So think about your business and say, what am I collecting that I really don't need to collect? So if you don't need to collect some of this information on the slide, then train your employees not to collect that information. Because then if you had a breach, you don't have to worry about what kind of PII data got stolen and who do you need to notify. Now, some businesses will need to collect some of this information. If that's the case, then make sure that it's well protected. Let's do another quick poll just to test your knowledge on which of the following is not PII. And I'm saying this in general terms. Don't worry about what states, but just general terms. So the poll's up on the slide. If you could pick that up or select your right answer. Hopefully we're not that divided on this question. Also, while you're filling out the poll, we do have a chat box open. If you have any questions or even comments you want to share, please post that chat line. We'll address them as they come in. And it's just not a question. It's even comments or some of your experiences you want to share. That'd be fine too. So 73% said weight, height, hair color. That clearly is not PII, but the 20% said name, address, phone number. Colin, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're talking here from a state statute standpoint, and that's right. I mean, the name, address, and phone number is basically directory information, phone book information, and we'll keep that is the focus. I don't want to get too far into the weeds and talk about the GDPR, for example, where if you have business over in the EU, they do protect more generic elements like that, and there's a nuance to it and some risk of harm and some tests that we can get into to whether that's actually notifiable under different outside the United States statutes or regulatory schemes. But for our purposes here, that's absolutely right. That's something you can look up in the white pages and is not the type of thing to be notified. And then just a reminder for the medical records, financial records could be PII depending on the state. Certainly the financial record, it can be a little misleading. Financial account number certainly is going to be PII everywhere. And by that, I mean really a deposit account. There's some discussion about whether a mortgage loan or a 401k account or something like that you can't typically get too much access to is going to trigger that. But In some states, medical records will be, and all states' financial account numbers of a deposit are going to be, depository account are going to be protected. So just a quick refresher on that.
Thank you, Colin. So let's start the stages now from a recovery standpoint. So the first stage is the preparation, and I would say that's a pre-incident stage. So this is now before you've had an incident. And I would say this is the most important phase. So this is you identifying what kind of data and assets you have. And doesn't mean you have to go down to the granular level, but at least you got to know, I collect credit card data and it's stored on my server here, stored on a third-party server, whatever that might be. You just know what you have. Develop an incident response playbook. So have a playbook with different scenarios. If one of your employees' laptop gets stolen, what are the first 3 things you're going to do, and what are the next 5 things you're going to do? In this example, you would need to know what kind of data was sitting on that employee's laptop. So was there any financial, was there any payroll data, was there any client data? And then the second thing is how you're protecting that laptop. So if the laptop was encrypted, you know the data wasn't stolen or lost. It's just that you've lost now a physical laptop. What happens if you had a phishing test? What would you do? What happens if you had ransomware attack? I was doing this exercise, and actually I'll tell you in a second about the example. Focus, I would say, on common attacks. So don't worry about a huge data breach or a big attack on your company. Let's say you attack for different reasons. Focus on common ones. What are the most common things? Phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, malware. An employee losing a laptop is a common attack. Focus more on the common attacks, and then train your key participants. So you, as the owner of the business, should be a participant in your response playbook. So should be your operations manager, your HR manager. You probably might have somebody participate from a legal standpoint. You want to make sure that you're touching your cyber insurance policy along with your playbook, because you don't want to do something that works against the cyber insurance policy. So this is a very important phase. And then the last one, test the plan. And the example I was going to use is I was working with a client, and the scenario was a hacker had brought down their website, or actually at that time had put up a fake political message on their website. And when we started doing the exercise, we talked about, well, I need to call so-and-so, we need to do this, but what they forgot was the first step really was to bring down that page down. Even if they had a blank page, was to bring the page down. So I think that's what testing the plan helps you. Figures out some of the logic issues you might have, or some of the missing things you might have. You might have a phone number that's outdated, someone's outdated phone number in your playbook. So it's very important. This is an important stage. This stage is before an incident, but it helps you prepare and get ready to respond to an incident. So after you feel you have an incident, you need to determine when it happened, how it happened, and who could have done it. So, for example, you might have noticed some things. You might have to go back in your logs and look at when was the unusual activity. How was it done? Was it done because somebody clicked on an email? You might have gotten a phishing attack a week ago, and this could have been an outcome of that. Who clicked on that link? And then what was impacted? So that's something that you should be able to quickly, at least at a high level, figure out what happened here. This would also be a good time to review your insurance policy, cyber insurance, see what steps they dictate. And also, it's a good time to start documenting everything. You're going to need that documentation from a cyber insurance policy standpoint. You're going to need that documentation later when you go back and see, okay, what happened in this whole incident. And then I'd also say contact legal. And there's a couple of reasons for legal. One is you get the client attorney privilege, so you don't have to disclose some of the items, but also legal will tell you about what are your disclosure requirements. And I don't know, Colin, if you want to add a little bit on the legal counsel part.
Yeah, so the legal counsel piece, I'm fortunate to do a lot of this work, and the term that gets thrown around a lot is breach coach, or quarterback of response effort, that kind of thing. Some tired sports cliche, which basically says that we're kind of trying to run things. And the reason that we come into these matters is, because we identify the legal issues that arise, we hire vendors, we hire the IT support, the forensic support for our clients, so that everything that they're doing is cloaked in the attorney-client privilege, and we have the ability to say, to hold on to what we need to when we want to, and so. And from within that cocoon, really, that safe space, so to speak, we can use the findings that we're getting from the forensic investigation and maybe negotiation with threat actors and that kind of thing to identify the extent of the exposure and the possible obligations that have been tripped, whether that's going to be related to PII, whether that's a contractual obligation you might have with a business partner that has some provisions in it. So we do want to get involved early. That privilege piece, we get going too fast and too quickly, we're going to, that may be out the door, and you'd be in a position where you find some things that you don't necessarily want to be disclosing voluntarily, and that's a value add that we have there. So we also get involved quickly with messaging. Sometimes you got to talk to your employees about what's going on, but you don't want to spill too many of the beans. You're having a network issue right now. You don't want to get everyone worked up about ransomware per se or whatever, because that has a lot of that triggers a lot of questions that we won't likely have the answers to early on. Did they get my data? Am I safe? Or am I going to be at risk for identity theft? Truthfully, when you first learn of an incident, you don't know whether they got things or not, or if they did, what it is that they took. So messaging is going to be really important. You may not be able to perform your business operations such that a client might need to be reached out to let them know that something's going on, but we want to be real careful with that messaging about what it is we say, what we commit to. Because the last thing we want is a situation where we're committing to one thing or saying one thing, we got to walk it back later, and we start to lose credibility with that. So legal early on is a good contact. Insurance early on is going to be a good contact. Unfortunately, a lot of my work does actually come through insurance relationships, and I'll tell you that most of those carriers that I work with expect to be the first or second call, because they're going to have some guidelines about who we bring in and what we do and how we do it. So you want to make sure that you're putting them on notice as quickly as reasonable. Speaking with your broker, obviously, speaking with the people who know the policy and the requirements. But those are some of your first calls.
You want to spend a little bit more on that education also?
Yeah. So on this slide we've laid out some of the goals of the investigation, right? And this is going to be, I think, this is almost like a timeline of what we're trying to get after. This is not the kind of thing that's going to ultimately be discovered, first day, couple days of an investigation. It's going to keep developing as we go. We're going to learn more things. Raj mentioned the training and what you find out bad phone numbers and the like. I do a lot of those sessions, and we leak out little bits of facts every for discussion, and then you change them, because as you're going through an investigation, it's not always going to be linear. It's not always going to be as you would expect. So there's a lot of moving pieces at the same time. And but we're ultimately trying to get to the bottom of a couple things. How do they get in? What do they interact with while they were there, from either looking at it or taking it? Are they out? And then what as a result of that might have triggered from a notice obligation. You may have contracts that say that if you have a security incident of any kind, you have to notify us. Or if you have a security incident involving a business client's data, you have to notify them. Well, you don't know that right at the beginning, whether that impacted their data or not. You have to do that investigation and find out. Of course, the PII, PHI angle is going to be something that we're regularly going to need some time to figure out whether we're going to ultimately have that exposure or not. When we're talking about a ransomware attack, there are a couple ways that's going to be figured out, if it can be. And not every forensic investigation, unfortunately, can provide all the answers to all these questions all the time. There are going to be some gaps based on the available evidence that are there a lot of the time. Every now and then you get a threat actor who just makes no effort to cover their tracks, and that's great. Use tools that are easily traceable, whatever, and there's good logging, and so you can really piece it together. But more often than not, you're making decisions based on available evidence, which might not be the complete picture. But you do the best you can with what you have. But ultimately, we look to, has there been access to data, which that can be shown by various different artifacts sometimes, and has there been acquisition of data, exfiltration of data, where they took that out? And when we identify both access and exfiltration, because access alone can be enough, depending on where someone resides, to trigger a breach, the breach definition. Take all that data together and say, all right, what's here? And sometimes we learn of that entirely from the system. Sometimes we learn of that because in almost all instances anymore, we do engage with the threat actor, even if we have good backups, because we want to know from them what it is that they claim that they took. They are usually more than happy to share that with you because that's their secondary, pressure point where they're going to try to extract an extortion payment from you. Is even if you have good backups, hey, we have your data, we're going to post in the dark web unless you pay us. So they'll tell you usually what they took, if they took it, and then we piece that kind of information together with the forensics, and ultimately get down to a data set of what has been compromised, if anything, and that will go through a review process. Sometimes we can say, well, they got the HR folder, and you can run a run report, and everyone who's in the HR folder, and just give us that, and that's the body of people who are impacted. Sometimes it's more of a hodgepodge where you say we've got 50 gigabytes of user data, and we don't know exactly what's in here. It's not structured. We got to search it for PII, PHI, or whatever the case may be. So we'll go through a process where we identify the individuals within the impacted population, ultimately get a notification list together, do that analysis that I talked about earlier about, okay, it's medical, but they live in Michigan. Do they need a letter or not? Of course, there can be business considerations that ultimately come into this. A lot of the time we're dealing with employee information, and sometimes you have employees that live in one state and some that live in another, and you want to treat everyone the same even though they live in different states where it might not be required because it might be easier to handle that way. We'll go through that, talk through that with our clients about the business implications of our compliance with state statutes, if there are going to be any. And then we put together, notifications based on what happened, which some of these things that we're trying to get at from the investigation. When did they get into the system? How long were they in the system? And then, specifically what data for these individuals was ultimately impacted. From a, investigation unfolding standpoint, are we, and this is stepping back a little bit from the notification piece, how are we recovering? So do we have good backups? The way you recover from a ransomware attack, there are really kind of, I think, three high level. You walk away from your data, you don't need it anymore, and you're not going to worry about it being gone, which is almost nobody. You very rarely run into a situation where someone can go that way. You restore from backups, good backups that are up to date and safe, not encrypted and deleted in the attack, or you pay the ransom. So we've got to get into a situation where we're identifying quickly, is important data encrypted? If so, how are we going to handle that? And develop sort of a parallel path plan where we're negotiating, trying to restore from backup at the same time, and the like. So there are a lot of things that we're ultimately doing at the same time to try to answer those questions: how they get in, what they do, are they out, what obligations have been tripped, and how do we improve ourselves from a going forward posture here, and then compliance with obligations, whether contractual or statutory.
So think of this as similar to if you had a physical incident at your location, you're going to first figure out what happened. So it's very similar in a cyber incident. But then what you're going to do is you're going to try to stop the spread. So, same thing in a physical, you disconnect all devices, you inform your employees, you might put the yellow tape around where that physical event happened. Same thing you're going to do in a cyber. You're going to disconnect affected devices. I can tell you how many times I work with a client that had a breach and they've still not disconnected their devices. Those devices are still connected to the internet. So that's the first thing you want to do, even at home. If you feel there's an incident, disconnect that device from the internet. Then the first point is don't delete. That happens all the time where companies will delete something because they thought, if I reboot my machine, then that's the best way to see what happened. Well, you've just deleted some of the data or evidence that might be happening. So careful of what you delete. Reset your password. So if you feel you had a phishing attack and only 3 employees clicked on it, it's prudent to have everyone reset their password. It's prudent for you to go home and reset your other password. So that's a good time always to stop the spread. Is resetting passwords will stop a number of cyber incidents. Informing all your employees. Update your patches and antivirus. So let's say you got hacked in the morning, you might be behind on some of the patches and antivirus. So as you want to contain the issue, make sure you update them so that you're not impacted again by the same issue. Now, you might not always need to develop a media plan, but if this was going to get leaked out, if this was going to be a local issue and it's going to be in the papers or TV or radio, make sure you have a media plan of how you're going to address this. You clearly don't want all your employees to walk out of the building and talk about it if there's press standing out. You clearly want to make sure that you have your talking points ready. So hopefully you don't have to execute on a media plan, but it's always good to have one.
Absolutely. And I want to
encourage legal counsel. So Colin, go ahead and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I just want to reemphasize that point about deleting the evidence. It's such a hindrance to what we're talking about here from the legal aspect of things, because you'll come in and people have already wiped and restored devices, and those are the key devices where the evidence would have resided that would allow forensics to rule out a significant compromise, right? But without the evidence there to do it, then we're left in a situation where we have to make some judgment calls based on things like the MO, the threat actor, and other circumstantial evidence that may not be all that sound, and we really miss an opportunity to review the actual evidence and ultimately give the client an opportunity to make some informed decisions. So pick up the phone, call insurance, call forensics, call legal, and let's do that before we start restoring anything. And then sort of just kind of recapping what we've talked about a little bit already about from a legal standpoint, why I'm there is to bring in that privilege, and then ultimately do we have a reportable breach? If so, to what extent? Where individuals, regulators, where do your individuals that are impacted reside? Some of this stuff is ultimately going to be, like I said, playing out over a lengthy period of time. I mean, I have notify insurance carrier at the bottom here, but that's going to be near the top because they're going to be wanting to be involved in this process. But as we go through the investigation, let's get engaged first. That's where that privilege comes in. And then this whole, determining applicable laws can be something that we deal with right away. Are you in a particularly regulated space where we might have some things to be concerned about beyond just the state laws, which apply to everybody? And then, as a result of that, we have earlier disclosure obligations, the requirements than we might have under other state schemes. And then, from forensics or other types of investigation, can we determine how many records are impacted, what type of information is there, and is that in fact reportable under an applicable statutory scheme?
I'm going to say this is very similar. If you had somebody got hurt in your facility really bad, what would you do? You would call legal, you would figure out the applicable laws, you would make sure you record everything, you think about from an insurance standpoint. So it's no different with a cyber breach. Colin, do you want to cover the next slide quickly a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So when you're doing these, this analysis, like I said, we're sort of getting down to this, how they get in, what do they interact with? So what do they interact with? We've figured that out. We've got the data isolated, and going through a review process, we have some individuals that are impacted. Maybe it's employees, maybe it's customers, and they have social security numbers, driver's license numbers, that kind of thing. The third-party business partner or vendor, as I said a couple times, this is becoming a more common thing that contracts are including provisions in them that require you to notify the business partner if you have a situation. So in the review of the data that's been impacted, are we identifying any of that protected information? And one of the things I talked about on a very first call with a client is that contract issue, because they will have, if the provision exists, it can have some really quick timing requirements under them. It can be immediately, or 2 days, or 5 business days, or something like that, where you're going to have to be aware of that and get out with that message. And it may be an incomplete message at the early stages, but it'll be something that we'll probably have to follow up with later as we get to the bottom of that investigation and find that data is actually involved. It can be, of course, a bit of a sideshow, unfortunately, when you're spending all of your resources you're trying to on your own recovery, and you have to notify a business partner about this issue, and they have questions and they want you to talk to their security team and the like. So it's a little bit of an aside. But when you notify individuals, there can be notification obligations to those state regulators as well. I'll tell you, in Michigan, we don't have an AG notice requirement. We can notify 100,000 people in Michigan, and we don't have to notify the Attorney General. If we have one person who lives in Indiana, and we almost always do, we have to notify their attorney general, and they will send us information requests. They want more information about the incident. They're going to sort of open up a quasi investigation in every single matter that involves even one Indiana resident. But that will be something that we'll be looking at when we get the list of affected individuals is, all right, who's going to get notification based on the statutes where in the states where they reside, and then does this trip a AG reporting requirement? Like I said, Indiana, Massachusetts, Connecticut, a number of states where if you have one person impact, you have to notify the AG. Other states require it if you have 250 or 500. So we'll be looking at those obligations to see whether we have any notifications. Consumer reporting agencies, the big three, TransUnion, Equifax, Experian, certain states require you to notify if you reach certain thresholds. The thought being that basically they're going to get bombarded with requests, so they should be on the alert that this might be happening. And then from a law enforcement standpoint, we're going to have potential obligations. I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to ransomware in a moment, or ransom payment. There's not usually an obligation to report to law enforcement unless you're going to make a payment. It can be a good thing as a corporate citizen to do that. The FBI in particular is investigating this cybercrime. These groups that are attacking are relatively well known in most cases. They cycle through a fair amount, but the FBI can use the information that we gather in our investigation to try to build a bigger case against them and ultimately hopefully take them down. So something to consider. Regularly talk to clients about law enforcement and can we get them involved early. And I have to tell them, unfortunately, they don't have the resources to kind of come in and help us per se, but we know what they're going to want from us, and they'll eventually, we'll eventually give that to them. So, mentioning the contracts again, indemnification obligations. A lot of the time, let's say we have third-party data, right? It's not actually ours; it's our client's data that we host. We have an obligation to notify that client so that they can take care of the notifications to their impacted individuals. Our obligation is actually, unless there's an indemnification provision in our arrangement, is done at that point. We have done what we need to do. We told our client. As a practical matter, almost no one does that. They say, hey, this happened and we're going to take care of this for you because we have a valuable relationship and we want to take care of it and not leave that in your lap. But that can be something that as we're going through this investigation, we're looking at those contracts, we're looking at any cost shifting provisions. Sometimes you may have a third party that wants to take it on themselves and then wants to bill you for it later. So you're going to want to look at whether that's going to be applicable or not. And then all along the way, we are assessing litigation, regulatory risks that might come out of this. As I said earlier, regulatory action. If we notify Indiana, they're going to send us some information requests. That's a sort of regulatory action, right? But most of those things, if you've done the right things, are going to be, checking under the hood, but ultimately, giving you at worst a warning letter, hey, do better next time. But they're, if we're talking and we're, evaluating what is your security posture before this occurred, and the answers are, not satisfactory, then we have to start thinking about what are we putting anything in place now so that we can say that we have it now when we ultimately deal with these inquiries. And then litigation, this won't surprise anybody, is becoming a larger issue. Uncommon to have single plaintiff litigation out of a data breach, but class actions are continuing to be filed. Plaintiffs' lawyers are soliciting them everywhere. They troll the AG websites because some AGs put the notifications that you have to submit up on their website so they can see that, and they solicit classes. And classes used to have to be fairly large for it to be something that would catch much attention. I've seen the size of classes seemingly getting a little bit smaller, more litigation being filed. So we would be looking at that, and a lot of that will be driven by, is this a breach involving social security numbers? If yes, it's going to be higher. The risk of litigation is going to be higher than if it's a breach involving medical information or dates of birth or something like that. They're going to have a harder time substantiating some sort of damage with. So we're looking at all of that and doing the best we can with compliance to not do any harm or make risk our position anymore to the exposure to civil organization or civil litigation. And then of course, one of the things that unfortunately, most of these incidents start from some failure of some person, inadvertent. We're all human. Human error is the leading cause of these breaches. In particular with HIPAA, but really any regulatory scheme, you really want to take a look at how did this happen, who is responsible for it, and how do we show that we are correcting that error. Maybe it's training, access training, maybe it's termination if this person has a particularly checkered past as it relates to this type of security stuff. So taking a look at that and examining that, probably with an employment lawyer, but a little bit of a root cause analysis and seeing, documenting how it is we're going to address that and fix that going forward.
Great, thanks. We might have to speed this up a little bit. We got 10 minutes left. So let's go to the next one is eradication. So Colin talked about investigation, but for most of you on the webinar, attend the webinar, your IT team or your IT provider should be able to help you fix the root cause. They should be able to remove the malware if there was a malware. If they need to put in more hardening your systems and better controls, they'll be able to do that. Retest your network. They should be able to review a log. So a lot of the eradication, you should be able to do it yourself. But there will be times where either the insurance company or the nature of the breach will require you to hire forensic consultants. So these consultants, there are actually a number of firms that all they do is cyber forensic work. They look at what happened and help you recover, especially if you have ransomware and you don't want to pay. Then they might come in and help you recover your systems and all the data. Recovering and restoring, again, backups are very important. If you don't want to pay ransomware, if you have great backups and a good IT team, then you should be able to recover within a day to 3 days. Generally, you can recover from a ransomware. But again, you'd need the data backed up really well, and you'd need somebody that knows your systems well enough to help you restore them. After you recover, you want to reconcile your data. So this could be a simple thing as checking your financials before and after, make sure the numbers still add up and reconcile, checking the volume of your data. So there's different ways you want to reconcile your data just to make sure that nothing got lost. Obviously, notifications to customers, executing the media plan. But even along with the recovery, make sure you preserve all your data. Make sure you're going back to your response plan. Make sure that you're following all the steps. If you need to involve law enforcement, then you should let them know. Not every incident requires notifying law enforcement, but there are times when you do. And so that's something that, again, your legal counsel will help you connect the dots and when and how to connect to law enforcement. The last step is how to stop a cyber attack. And so after you've recovered, you want to sit back with your team and say, all right, did our incident response plan work, or do we need to update it? What are the lessons learned? You might have to retrain employees because maybe they're still clicking on links and you feel like that was the cause of the attack, or they're downloading software. So you might have to retrain your employees, but you also want to retest your systems in 6 months. You want to make sure that you're still not exposed. You want to make sure your systems are hardened so you don't have a second attack. So these are the 3 things you want to do at the end when the dust has settled and you have recovered. You still want to go back and see what lessons you learned from that. Before we go to a poll question, Colin, can you talk a little bit about ransomware payments, how that happens, and what steps need to be followed?
Yeah, so just real briefly, hopefully never have to get to this, but ransom payments, as I said, there's three options usually with a ransom situation: restore from backup, deal without, or pay. We think pay is the last resort. We don't want to enrich these criminals, and it's usually, as Raj said, restoring from backup is going to be faster and cleaner. So, but first we're going to assess, do we need to make that payment? And another cautionary tale, we typically don't recommend paying just for data deletion. That is one of the things that the ransomers do try to do, is we won't post your data if you pay us. If you don't need a key, that's not usually a good deal. They don't give you anything for it. They're still criminals, and your obligations are still triggered. So, we usually discourage that. Payments can be negotiated. We regularly work with folks who, on the forensic team, or even independent negotiators, who handle that for our clients. They act as our client. They don't indicate they are a negotiator, hired negotiator. And they can, get that payment reduced down usually. It depends on how much time you have. We do have circumstances where a client says, I lose, $1 million a day. I can't afford to negotiate, just pay. But we have situations where clients say I can limp along for a couple of weeks with these functions, and we can use that to really get the negotiated number down. And these groups have track records. They are known entities most of the time, although every now and then you have ransomware as a service groups that don't ultimately have as much of a track record. But we use that to craft a strategy and ultimately get down, hopefully reduce that payment. And then there's a legal issue now with payment that we have to be mindful of. Another reason why we're involved. The United States Treasury issued some guidelines that says basically you cannot pay certain groups. Now that list of groups is very small, but they are sanctioned effectively. And in order to make a payment to a threat actor, we need to attest that we have no reason to believe that they are affiliated with one of those two groups. We do that, the forensic team will look at the indicators of compromise, basically the fingerprints, and the ways that they act and say, okay, this is this group, this is Black Cat. And we know that they're not on the sanction list, we're good. And then we have to file an IC3 report with the FBI. I mentioned earlier, you don't have to notify the law enforcement unless you make a payment. If you do make a payment, you need to notify the FBI. They will then reach out and collect evidence basically about the attack. They treat you as appropriately. You're the crime victim, and that's how they look at it. But you do have those obligations in order to comply with that guidance from Treasury, which does have the force and effect of actual significant penalties if you do make a knowing payment to a sanctioned threat actor. There could be criminal, civil, personal fines associated with that. And then, unfortunately, the ransomware key is not just the plug and play. It's not a light switch. You're going to need to go through systems and identify which ones are most important and start that way. And typically recommend backing up data before you encrypt it, decrypt it, because there can be corruption in that process. And if it happens while you're decrypting your only set of data, you can lose it. You're back to square one with no reasonable way of recovering it. So just a few considerations there when contemplating and making a ransom payment.
Yeah, thanks for covering this because it's an important topic. You can't just pay the ransomware. There is some protocol you have to follow. So that was good information. Let's do one last quick poll and then we'll start wrapping up this session. Do you have an incident response plan, a plan that is written and documented, or no, are you working on it? If you could just make a quick selection and then we'll look at the responses. Okay, so big group is still working on it. You don't have it, and there's still a small group that has documented and tested. And really, that's what you want to do. You want to have a documented plan, and you want to get it tested. The testing the plan is very easy. You just do a tabletop exercise and follow the steps through your plan, and you should be able to find if there's any gaps in there, if things don't flow, or if there's incorrect information. So a couple slides and we should be done. So one is, prevention is better than recovery. So make sure you have great cyber hygiene. Make sure you have proactive approach to security and privacy, strong security, hygiene, and policies, a written plan, rigorous training of employees. To me, that's the most important thing. Your weakest link is the employees. A number of phishing and ransomware attacks happens because an employee didn't do the right thing, and then continuously monitoring. I'm hoping that you've been able to fight the strong lion with this session, and I was surprised you didn't find a lion with a bruised nose in this picture, but this is the real one where a zebra kicked the lion in the face. So we're hoping you can do that also. I do want to thank Colin for joining us on this session. I think it was important to get a legal perspective. And so thank you for joining us. I know we covered a lot, so there will be a recorded session that you can go back on. If you want a copy of this slide deck, you can either send Kelly an email or me at rajpatel@senscy.com. That's rajpatel@senscy.com. And we can get you a copy of the slide deck. If you have any questions, there's an Ask an Expert section on the SBEM website. If you go on the cyber one, that question will come directly to us, and we'll call you back or respond you with the appropriate answer. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.